Hello, American literature friends, and welcome to another session. This is going to be the Raymond Carver session. We're going to cover his story, A Small Good Thing. The first thing I want to do is talk about Carver, give a little bit of biographical information about him. You will notice that we are not reading the story that's in the book, which is Cathedral, which has probably become his most famous short story. We're going to read A Small Good Thing, I think because it is a little bit easier to understand, and it fits into some of the things we've already done in this class a little bit better. We're going to talk about Carver a little bit. We will then talk about minimalism, which is the genre, the style that he is often seen as belonging to, and that he is often seen as sort of the most representative of. Not necessarily the master of, like Faulkner is the sort of king of the Southern Renaissance, or Jack Kerouac is sort of the greatest writer of the beats, but he is seen as the most representative of that group of minimalist writers from the mid-1970s and 1980s. And then we'll dig into the story and get into the main parts of it as concisely as we can. A Small Good Thing is an interesting story because Carver wrote a version of it that was only about half as long as the version we are reading is. And then later he came back and expanded it to a much bigger, much longer story. It's interesting because Carver very clearly had two different sections of his career. His first books, which they mention in the book on page 742 in the biographical introduction to him, his first books, Will You Please Be Quiet, Please, and what we talk about when we talk about love, are these relatively shorter stories. They're often the stories in early Carver are only 2, 3, 4 pages long. And it's not until you get to Cathedral, his later work in the 1980s, that he starts writing these longer stories like the one that we are going to read, A Small Good Thing. And so he starts off with this very stripped down basic style. You see on page 742, minimal fiction, designer fiction, even dirty fiction. There were several different phrases used to characterize the new style of American writing that came out in the late 70s and especially in the 1980s. It was popularized by writers like Bobby M. Mason, Ann Beatty, Frederick Barthelme, and Barry Hannah. But as I said, Raymond Carver is very clearly the most famous, most representative version of them. A recovering alcoholic, Carver had worked as a janitor, a sawmill hand, a delivery person, and a sales representative, suggesting the profile of this sort of blue-collar. A lot of characters in Raymond Carver stories are from blue-collar backgrounds, working-class backgrounds. They often live in the suburbs or just outside the city. And as you see on page 743, they're talking about minimalism and Carver's very basic style. Minimalism is often read as this reaction to the experimentalism, to sort of highly experimental, sort of wild, sometimes science fiction, sometimes absurdist styles of the late 50s, 1960s, early 1970s. Most especially that we've read in this class, people like Kurt Vonnegut, but they talk on 743. The conventions of literary realism had been challenged, and theorists questioning all such previously stable assumptions, readers of Barth, Donald Barthelme, Kurt Vonnegut, and other such experimental writers may have felt that simple realism was no longer an up-to-date way in which to write, but Raymond Carver proved that it was, and that previous challenges to the realistic tradition had only made it all the more effective. Carver's characters are usually working-class people, somewhat down on their luck. They're often totally unexceptional, but their failures and their hopes are small. They're not these wild, dramatic, absurdist, experimental things. But from such stripped-down essentials, the author is able to write in a plain, simple manner, sticking to the absolute minimum so that no one can accuse him of trying to create illusions. That's one of the central ideas of minimalism and of Carver's writing is it is sort of this pushback against the first wave of postmodernism, and it's kind of a return to the realism of the late 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, that moment that we've talked about in this class with writers like Kate Chopin and Ambrose Bierce, this return to just this simple, straightforward, stripped-down description of actions and reactions and causes and results and consequences. Carver gives you these very basic, straightforward explanations and descriptions of what people do, what they want, and then he just takes you through the story. Carver, you can see in the book, let's get him pulled up here. He was born in 1938. He passed away in 1988. He had a period, the first sort of, the 1960s and 1970s, he clearly developed a problem with alcoholism. He became an alcoholic. And then sometime in the mid-1970s, he began going to Alcoholics Anonymous. He got his alcoholism under control. He ultimately died from lung cancer in 1988, in part because he was such a heavy smoker. But he did manage to get his alcoholism under control. And a lot of people point towards his sobering up as the shift in his style from those very short stories of his early career to the sort of longer, more thoughtful, deeper, a little bit more complex stories of the last 10 or 15 years of his career, from the mid-70s on into 1988 when he passed away. Like I said, A Small Good Thing very clearly belongs to that later, softer, slower paced Raymond Carver. Let's get into that story. And if you have questions about Carver or about minimalism, you can be in touch with me about them, but we'll just go ahead and dive into the story. Let me put our book aside. I'm using Carver's Where I'm Calling From, which is a collection of his stories. Carver never wrote a novel. All that we have of his are short stories. And A Small Good Thing is, like I said, one of the longer. It's about as long as anything you get from Carver. Let's get A Small Good Thing pulled up for you guys too. One of the things that's important to recognize about this book and about this story and the setup of it is the first two sections of this story. This section, the Saturday afternoon section, she drove to the bakery, and then the second section, which is the section that begins on Monday morning. Where are you? Which is the section that begins here. So here's the first section, Saturday afternoon, and then on Monday morning is the second section. The first two sections of this story set up the rest of the story. You get the baker and the cake order, and then you get Scotty. And Scotty is hit by the car in the second section and taken to the hospital, so the cake is forgotten. So everything that is going to come, and at the end of the second section, the baker calls and reminds the family about the forgotten cake. So everything that is going to come later in this story is set up in this first section. All the characters, the cake that is going to trigger all this motion and reaction from the baker, and then eventually the realization and reaction from the mother. All of this. And the other thing in the very first section, this sort of isolation of the baker, the failure, the mom tries to make small talk with him. Here it is. The mom tries to make small talk with him but fails. There were no pleasantries between them, just a minimum exchange of words, the necessary information. He made her feel uncomfortable. He's going to make her feel much more uncomfortable as this story goes along. And she didn't like that. While he was bent over the counter with the pencil in his hand, she studied his coarse features and wondered if he'd ever done anything else with his life. And you find out later that he has not. This has been his career. He has no children. And so he struggles to relate to her. He works in isolation. He works all night. His job causes him to not interact with many people, and he struggles to connect with people, which he finally does at the end of the story. The mom and dad push through his isolation, and they connect, and he is kind to them at the end of the story. She was a mother, 33 years old, and it seemed to her that everyone, especially someone the baker's age, a man old enough to be her father, must have children who'd gone through this special time of cakes and birthday parties. There must be that between them, she thought. But he was abrupt with her. Not rude, just abrupt. She gave up trying to make friends with him. And they work out, they finish their transaction over the cake and go on. And then you get, on Monday morning, the birthday boy walking to school. The birthday boy is walking to school with another boy. They're passing a bag of potato chips back and forth, and the birthday boy was trying to find out what his friend intended to give him for his birthday. Without looking, the birthday boy stepped off the curb at an intersection and was immediately knocked down by a car. He fell on his side with his head in the gutter and his legs out in the road. Here you get a really good example of Carver's minimalism. He gives you this very basic, very straightforward description. Scotty steps out in the road, is hit by a car, falls down. There's not all of this drama or interior depth or development. You just get this straightforward, minimal description of the accident. Scotty turns around, walks back home, slips into what will become the coma. As of course the birthday party was canceled. The child was in hospital with a mild concussion and suffering from shock. You get right here the other main character in the story, Dr. Francis, who misses the occlusion that ultimately kills Scotty. And you get the dad too. You get Ann's husband, Howard, Scotty's dad, drove home from the hospital. He took the wet, dark streets very fast, then caught himself and slowed down. So they take Scotty to the hospital. Scotty's in a coma. And the dad is feeling isolated right here. His left leg began to tremble. You get the first hints of the kind of isolation. The dad feels alone in his grief and anxiety and stress. The mom, Ann, feels alone and isolated in her anxiety and stress. He shouldn't have left the hospital. He shouldn't have. God damn it, he said. He picked up the receiver and said, I just walked in the door. There's a cake that wasn't picked up. And this is the first time in the story that the baker calls and reminds them about the cake. And he doesn't know. And the dad is so stressed out and isolated and anxious and in his own world that he forgets about this later. And it's the mom who has to remember. It's the baker who's been calling and bothering them. He arrived, and then the dad goes back to the hospital. He arrives back at the hospital a little bit after midnight. And what you get in these next few sections is Scotty is unconscious. He won't wake up. And the parents, as these sections sort of go along, the parents begin to feel the stress and anxiety and fear that they have just slowly escalates and builds. And they can't feel like they're not getting a straight answer from the doctor. And at different parts of the story, they feel isolated and alone, and then have moments where they realize that they're not alone because they have each other to deal with this, which sort of foreshadows how they unite against the baker at the end of the story. And in spite of the doctor reassuring them, the real signal of their stress and anxiety and the way that it keeps sort of building is the conversation that pops up several times about, is this a coma? And the doctor won't call it a coma. And the doctor finally says, we'll call it a coma for now. What that really is signaling to you is that sort of building tension and building stress and isolation of them. You have this back and forth over these next few pages right here. The mom won't leave at first. I was saying maybe she could go home and get a little rest. The mom doesn't want to do that because the doctor's going to come sometime. Let's see. Let's go through this section here. You see right here, the dad asked, but he's out of real danger. You said before he's not in a coma. You wouldn't call this a coma. There's an example of no, I wouldn't call it a coma, the doctor said, glanced over at the boy once more. He's just in a very deep sleep. You see here the conversation about praying, where the mom says, I've been praying. I almost thought I'd forgotten how, but it came back to me. Again, that signal that she's feeling really isolated and does this thing that she hasn't done in years because she's so desperate for help for Scotty. You see right here this sentence at the top of this page. For the first time, she felt that they were together in it, this trouble. She realized with a start that until now, that it had only been happening to her and Scotty. She hadn't let Howard into it, though he was there and needed all along. She felt glad to be his wife. There's one of those moments of isolation and her sort of breaking through it. They take Scotty away to have the scan. They waited all day, but still the boy did not wake up. Occasionally one of them would leave the room to go downstairs. Dr. Francis came again that afternoon. Dr. Francis comes back in here. Let's see. There is more coma conversation. This is where, right here, is where the doctor finally calls it a coma, and it sort of escalates. You can feel that anxiety escalating. The doctor rubbed his smooth cheek. We'll call it that for the time being until he wakes up, but you must be worn out. And finally, the mom goes home. I won't be gone long. She goes home. She went to the door where she turned and looked back. This is where you get Franklin's family in here. This is kind of an important section in the story, mainly because Franklin's death both foreshadows what's coming for Scotty. Franklin dies first, then Scotty dies, but it also gives you this parallel situation, this parallel mom, this parallel child. There's a couple of things that we're going to read, and this is the first of them, and then we're going to read a couple of more that all have some version of literary doppelgangers. If you're not familiar with doppelganger, it means like a double. Originally, doppelganger meant sort of dark double or dark twin or almost evil double or something like that. But it has evolved to just mean almost like your twin or your double or something like that. Franklin and his family are very clearly doubles for Scotty and his mom and all that worry. As the mom is leaving the hospital, she first encounters Franklin's family. Unlike Scotty, Franklin was stabbed. You see right here, my son was hit by a car and said to the man he has a concussion. That's too bad. And then right here, our Franklin, he's on the operating table. Somebody cut him, tried to kill him. There was a fight where he was at. And Anne leaves, and again, it's another one of those moments. One of the things the interaction with Franklin does and with Franklin's family is teaches her that she's not alone. That she's not the only person in the world that this kind of thing is happening to. She's not isolated. Other families are wrestling with these same worries. She goes home, pulls into the driveway, and you get another call from the baker. But of course here she doesn't know who it is. Scotty, the man's voice said, it's about Scotty. It has to do with Scotty, that problem. Have you forgotten about Scotty? And the baker is very clearly talking about the cake. But of course, in the situation that she is in, she's stressed out. She's worried about the hospital and Scotty's life and death situation. She dialed the hospital's number and asked for the third floor. She demanded information about her son. Then she asked to speak to her husband. And she says, somebody just called here. He said it was about Scotty. Scotty's fine. He's still sleeping. There's been no change. And the wife is just, of course, this makes her more stressed out, but she has no clue who this was who called. She's totally caught up in the real life and death situation with her son. She goes back to the hospital. She took the elevator, you see right here. She took the elevator up to the third floor with two nurses who were just going on duty. She walked down the corridor to look for Franklin's family again, and they were gone. The chairs were scattered in such a way that it looked as if the people had just jumped up from them the minute before. She stopped at the nurse's station. She stops at the nurse's station and asks about Franklin. Franklin was his name. His family was in the waiting room. And they tell her that Franklin has passed away. Again, this foreshadows what's coming for Scotty, the sort of darkness that's coming for her. I met the family last night and said, my own son is in the hospital. I guess he's in shock. And again, she's just telling random strangers what's going on with Scotty because out of her anxiety and feeling of isolation and all that kind of stuff. She gets back to the hospital room. How is he? She went over to the bed. She dropped her purse on the floor. Dr. Francis was here a little while ago. You see Howard says, and then this is the end, this section, at the end of this section, this portion right here. Let's see if we can get it, highlighted there. At the end of this section is when Scotty sits up for a moment. Scotty, his mother said, moving to the bed, hey Scott, hey son. They leaned over the bed. Howard took the child's hand in his hands and began to pat and squeeze. Anne bent over the boy and kissed his forehead. So Scotty, honey, it's mommy and daddy, she said. The boy looked at them, but without any sign of recognition. Then his mouth opened, his eyes scrunched closed, and he howled until he had no more air in his lungs. And right there you have this very traumatic, extreme, intense moment where Scotty seems on the verge of coming out of the coma, but it's this last moment before he passes away from the hidden. The doctors called it a hidden occlusion and said it was 1 in a million circumstance. Maybe if it could have been detected somehow and surgery undertaken immediately, they could have saved him, but more than likely not. And they hadn't been able to see it on any x-ray. It's really not anybody's fault. It's just this horrible coincidence, and Scotty passes away. The family goes home. You have this intense scene where everybody is sort of shaken. They hug each other, they shake hands. There is some more of this attempting to connect, but people feeling isolated in this traumatic, intense moment. Dr. Francis put his hand around Howard's shoulders. He let go of Howard's shoulders and held out his hand. Howard looked at the hand. Then he took it. Dr. Francis put his arms around Anne once more. Again, these people trying to comfort each other and connect with each other in this moment of just like intense, overwhelming grief and trauma. The family goes back home, and of course, you see them make some calls to relatives and let people know this awful thing that has happened. But that is disrupted by, she was looking up another number when the telephone rang. She picked it up on the first ring. Hello, she said. Hello, she said, for God's sake, who is this? What is it you want? You're Scotty. I got him ready for you, the man's voice said. Did you forget about him? You evil bastard, she shouted into the receiver. How can you do this, you evil son of a bitch? Scotty, the man said, have you forgotten about Scotty? Then the man hung up on her. Howard heard the shouting and came in to find her with her arms over the table, weeping. He picked up the receiver and listened to the dial tone. The telephone rang again, and it is in this section right here, much later, just before midnight, after they had dealt with many things, the telephone rang again. It is at the end of this section that Anne, the mom, realizes who is calling them, who is harassing them, that it's the baker. She makes that connection in her mind that she has clearly been too upset and too stressed out to make, until finally she's like, oh, what we forgot is the birthday cake. And then you have the scene at the end. They drove down to the shopping center. The sky was clear and the stars were out. They drove around behind the bakery and parked. They got out of the car. Someone unlocked the door and opened it. The baker stood in the light and peered out at them. I'm closed for business. And Scotty's mom and dad, Ann and Howard, come in and confront the baker about what's going on. You're pretty smart for a baker, she said. Howard, this is the man who's been calling us. She clenched her fists. She stared at him fiercely. There was a deep burning inside her. Just a minute here, the baker said. Do you want to pick up your 3-day-old cake? That's it. I don't want to argue with you, lady. There it sits getting stale. And you have this very clear situation of isolation between Scotty's mom and dad and the baker. The baker is just trying to do business. He's annoyed. He's frustrated that he made this cake and then nobody came and picked it up. As he explains, like it's lost time and money for him. He has no clue what has been going on with Scotty and his family, who are also in their own kind of isolation with their trauma and their grief and their sorrow about losing their son. And what finally happens, you have him, lady, I work 16 hours a day in this place to earn a living. I work night and day in here trying to make ends meet. And he's trying to explain his own isolation, his own situation. You want the cake or not, I have to get back to work. Bakers work at night. And she says, I know bakers work at night. They make phone calls at night too. And then finally she breaks through to him. My son's dead, she said, with a cold, even finality. He was hit by a car on Monday morning. We've been waiting with him until he died. But of course, you couldn't be expected to know that, could you? Bakers can't know everything. And Howard says, shame on you, shame on you. The baker put the rolling pin back on the counter. He undid his apron and threw it on the counter. He looked at them and then he shook his head slowly. And what you're having right here is this moment where these two people who have been isolated from each other, who are in their own worlds, the baker in his simple work world, or he's working in the shop alone, and then these parents who have been trapped in their sort of isolated world of grief and sorrow and this extreme experience that they've been going through. And finally they break through and communicate with each other. And what you get at the end of this story is this very basic, very simple human kindness, human comfort, human connection. Please sit down, he said. Let me get you a chair. Sit down, please. Please sit down, you people. I wanted to kill you, she said. I wanted you dead. The baker had cleared a space for them at the table. He shoved the adding machine to one side along with the stacks of notepaper. And then he apologizes to them. Let me say how sorry I am. God alone knows how sorry. Listen to me, I'm just a baker. I don't claim to be anything else. I was maybe years ago, as a different kind of human being. I've forgotten, I don't know. But I'm not any longer if I ever was. And he says, we finally circle back to what Anne was thinking in that very first section of the story. I don't have any children myself, so I can only imagine what you must be feeling. All I can say to you now is that I'm sorry. Forgive me if I can't. I'm not an evil man, I don't think. Not evil like you said on the phone. Please let me ask you if you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. And then it was warm inside the bakery. Very clearly, Carver's using that as this sort of human warmth, human kindness. He's suggesting right there. You probably need to eat something, the baker said. I hope you'll eat some of my hot rolls. You have to eat and keep going. Eating is a small good thing in a time like this. You get this reference to the story, the small good thing. What's getting contrasted here at the end of the story is this distinction between this massive, painful, overwhelming experience that the parents are going through, and the way that you get through those things and get past them and deal with them when you're so overwhelmed and in situations like that is you take one little step at a time. You find small good things like hot rolls, hot cinnamon rolls, and things like that. That is how, when you just feel totally destroyed like this, the way you keep going is one small good thing and then another small good thing, and you have to sort of remind yourself that there is still good in the world. He served them warm cinnamon rolls just out of the oven. The icing's still runny. He put butter on the table, knives to spread the butter. Then the baker sat down at the table with them. They ate rolls and drank coffee. Anne was suddenly hungry, and the rolls were warm and sweet. She ate 3 of them, which pleased the baker. He began to talk. They listened carefully. Although they were tired and in anguish, they listened to what the baker had to say. They nodded when the baker began to speak of loneliness and of the sense of doubt and limitation that had come to him in his middle years. And again, what you get at the end of this story is they break through this isolation and separation and connect with each other, and it is a sort of comfort to both of them. He told them what it was like to be childless all these years, to repeat the days with the ovens endlessly full and endlessly empty. Smell this, the baker said, breaking open a dark loaf. It's a heavy bread, but rich. They smelled it. Then he had them taste it. It had the taste of molasses and coarse grains. They listened to him. They ate what they could. It was like daylight under the fluorescent trays of lights. They talked on into the early morning, the high, pale cast of light in the windows, and they did not think of leaving. So what you get at the end of this story is that isolation has been broken down by small good things like human connections, like human kindness, like somebody making some fresh food for you, these kinds of things. This is what pushes people forward through the overwhelming difficulties and surprise traumas and struggles that people get through life, is connecting with other people and having that sort of what Carver calls warmth, that human warmth. It was warm inside the bakery. So what you get in this story is this much more, the story spends a lot of time sort of breaking these people down and making them feel isolated, putting them through this horrible experience. And then the suggestion at the end of the story is the remedy for that kind of isolation and loneliness is to connect with people over whatever you can, over what you have in common, even if it's warm cinnamon rolls or something like that. You get a good sense of Carver's style in this too. People talk in these very minimal ways. Nobody has a long speech or anything like that. You get these simple descriptions of cinnamon rolls and of hospitals and of doctors and of things like that. There's not any kind of over-the-top extensive descriptions of things and like you might get in William Faulkner or even in Kurt Vonnegut or something like that. There's just this simple, straightforward description, this simple, straightforward, almost reporting of people's actions and feelings and consequences and reactions to each other, very similar to something like Ambrose Bierce, who we read at the beginning of the semester. That is the minimalism of the mid-1970s. Minimalism is really popular from, say, the mid-1970s until the late 80s, early 90s, something like that. It has this very clear 15 or 20 year vogue. And then by the time you get to the mid-90s, it has sort of run its course. And Raymond Carver has died. When Raymond Carver dies in the 1988, it loses its sort of mascot, its figurehead of the movement. If you have questions about Carver, or you're interested in other Carver stories, or you have questions about the response topic, you can see the response topic here. One of the central tropes, and if you don't know what trope means, it is a sort of device or image or something like that, central metaphor. One of the central tropes or themes in Carver's work is isolation, and many of his stories feature characters that seem to be disoriented. You can see that Anne and Howard are clearly disoriented in this story by the accident that eventually kills their child. Disconnected. Do you see a bunch of times in this story people feeling disconnected from each other, from other people, from the rest of the world, and or lonely? How is isolation important in a small good thing? We just talked a good bit about that. Or alternately, how is a small good thing the story of characters dealing with isolation and loneliness? It's pretty easy to sort of follow these characters and see how they are made to feel more and more lonely and then sort of pulled out of that at the end of the story. You don't have to answer both of those questions. It's really asking you whichever way is more useful to think about what's happening in this story. If you want to write this response topic, think about that. How is isolation important? Or how is this the story of characters dealing with isolation? Whichever one of those is most useful for you to approach this topic if you decide you want to write about it. If you have questions about this topic, be in touch with me, email, whatever's easiest for you. And hopefully you enjoyed this story. And I will see you next time. Thanks a lot, American literature folks.